What if everything we thought about climate change activism was missing a crucial spiritual dimension? The intersection of theology, social justice, and environmental crisis reveals some surprising truths about power and transformation.
That's such an intriguing perspective. How did you come to make these connections?
Well, I've been exploring Walter Brueggemann's work on prophetic tradition alongside modern climate science, and it's fascinating how he frames speaking truth to power as a radical act. When you pair that with the IPCC's sixth assessment report showing how climate impacts disproportionately affect marginalized communities, you start seeing these incredible parallels.
Hmm. So you're seeing modern climate activists in a similar role to historical prophets?
Exactly. And what's really powerful is how James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree adds another layer to this understanding. He shows how religious symbols can be both tools of oppression and liberation, which helps explain why some communities resist climate science while others embrace it as a justice issue.
That's fascinating. How does this theological perspective change our approach to environmental challenges?
Well, when you look at the data from the IPCC report through this lens, you see that the communities contributing least to global emissions, about 10% of the world's poorest populations, account for just 3% of consumption-based emissions, are facing the most severe impacts. It's a modern example of the systemic injustice that liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez have been writing about.
That reminds me of David Harvey's work on climate justice and capital. He really shows how these patterns of inequality are built into our economic systems.
Right? And what's really interesting is how Willie James Jennings's research on colonial Christianity helps explain why certain communities have such difficulty accepting climate science. He traces how theological ideas were used to justify both resource extraction and human exploitation.
So you're suggesting our environmental crisis has deep historical and spiritual roots that we need to address?
Exactly. The latest climate data shows we're approaching several tipping points, but just presenting these facts isn't enough. We need to understand how power structures, belief systems, and economic interests all intersect.
That's quite different from the typical technical solutions we usually hear about.
Well, that's because we've been treating symptoms rather than causes. When you look at projects like the People's Pulpit and artistic expressions like Rectangle, you see how combining scientific understanding with spiritual wisdom and artistic expression creates more powerful movements for change.
How do you see these different approaches working together in practice?
Think of it like an ecosystem. You need multiple elements working together. Scientific data provides the evidence. Theological insights help us understand resistance to change, and artistic expression helps process grief and imagine alternatives. Studies show that movements combining these approaches have been up to 60% more effective at creating lasting change.
That makes me wonder about the role of hope in all this. How do you maintain optimism while facing such challenging realities?
You know, Brueggemann talks about how the prophetic imagination isn't just about criticism. It's about energizing people with a vision of what could be. When you combine that with practical climate solutions and community-based action, you start seeing real possibilities for transformation.
How would you suggest people begin engaging with these ideas in their own communities?
Research shows that small groups studying these intersecting issues, what some call communities of resistance and renewal, have been particularly effective. They create spaces where people can engage with climate science while processing grief, study theology while working for justice, and create art while building alternative economic models.
That's quite a shift from how these issues are usually approached.
Exactly. And that's why it's so powerful. When we stop compartmentalizing these issues and start seeing their connections, we create more effective pathways for change. Studies of successful environmental movements show that those incorporating cultural and spiritual dimensions are typically 3 times more likely to achieve their goals.
What do you see as the most crucial next steps?
Well, the data shows we have about a decade to make significant changes, but the encouraging thing is that we're seeing more integration between different approaches to environmental and social justice work. Religious communities are becoming more engaged with climate activism, and environmental organizations are paying more attention to justice issues.
That brings us back to the importance of imagination in all this work.
Yes, and that's really the thread that connects everything. Whether it's Brueggemann's prophetic imagination, artistic expressions like rectangle, or the scientific scenarios in the IPCC report, we're all trying to imagine and create different futures. The key is remembering that transformation happens at multiple levels simultaneously: personal, communal, and systemic.
What a powerful way to bring these threads together.
And that's what gives me hope, seeing how these different approaches can work together. The data shows that integrated approaches to climate action are not just more effective, they're also more resilient and sustainable over time. It's not about finding one perfect solution, but about weaving together many different ways of understanding and acting in the world.